I want to get into our first lecture this week, which deals with world exploration, which of course has different names. They often refer to it as the nickname Age of Discovery or Age of Discoveries. So I'll kind of get into the background of early exploration, at least talking about what kind of happened like around the 15th century mostly. So we'll talk about that first. Of course, today I'll kind of get into some of those early explorers. You've had, of course, Vasco da Gama. I'll talk about him, but I'll talk about Prince Henry the Navigator. He was pretty vital and important early on with Portuguese exploration. I'll talk about, of course, Christopher Columbus, who you see over my right shoulder there. We'll get into him a lot as well. He's kind of influential also as well. I'm going to kind of first talk about, the background of exploration. You can kind of see here, those, of course, are the centuries of when, most of European world exploration predominantly happened. So mostly occurred between the 15th and 18th centuries. I'll kind of talk about exactly what was the Age of Discovery, because it does have different names. Some will call it the Age of Discoveries. Some will call it the Age of World Exploration. So you'll see different nicknames, reasons for why they call it that. There were other people that explored, like the Chinese. I think were known for exploring the Indian Ocean, but predominantly most of the major exploration occurred with the European powers, mostly in Western Europe. Of course, here's the nickname Age of Discovery, often used. But I'll kind of blow this up here, but you can see that those are some of the major countries that were really early on involved in the Age of Discovery. Spain and Portugal were the initial ones that really got it started. France and England came in later afterwards, as well by the, getting into the 1500s, etc. Also, the Dutch and others were involved too in Europe. In a lot of exploration. And a lot of the early explorers were Italian, if you know about that. We'll get into like Christopher Columbus and also Amerigo Vespucci. I heard of him as well. So those are some of the different explorers that were kind of involved in nations that were really seeking alternative trade routes at that time. I'll kind of talk about some of the reasons of why exploration occurred, like the factors that were kind of involved in it that led to it. But I'll kind of show you this map here real quick, exploring, kind of looking at how big, the actual map of the world looked like with exploration. You can see here that most of the countries in Western Europe were mostly involved. So obviously Spain, Portugal, again, France, England, those were the big ones. And you can see the areas that they mostly explored were the Americas, North and South America, Africa, also into Asia as well later. And you can see some of the early explorations that happened. Columbus, Magellan, Pedro Cabral, Vasco da Gama. I think it shows also, looks like also Bartholomew Diaz in that map. And you can see all the other areas that it led to eventually, areas that will be colonized by a lot of the European powers because of exploration in general. Now, later we'll kind of talk about how they'll start making maps and things like that. You can see like one of the first famous maps that they made by the 16th century, that Typus Orbis Terrarum version, which the Dutch, I think Abraham Ortelius was the one that eventually makes that later. They'll even start mapping the world and things like that also as well. Now, I wanted to get into what were some of the major reasons, factors, which eventually led to world exploration by the European powers. On the left there, you can see there the Crusades and the Renaissance. Those were kind of viewed usually as some of the reasons why early exploration began. The Crusades, if you know about it, were a series of holy wars that took place between the 11th and the 13th centuries, where mostly Catholic Europe tried to reconquer, the Holy Land, Israel, in the Middle East. But what happened was it introduced a lot of the Europeans to a lot of these commodities that came from Asia, like spices, gunpowder, tea, silk, glass, paint, porcelain, other things like that came westward, like across the Silk Route and all that. And so that was one of the first things that really influenced, they think, later exploration, especially in Western Europe and all that. And then the Renaissance was the other thing that they talk about was a early influence that led to exploration. They think that the Renaissance led to a lot of innovations, especially with like new ideas being spread, technological advancements like the development of the caravel, which we'll get to later, was kind of an invention, cartography, printing of books, the printing press, which was invented by, I think, Johann Gutenberg in the mid 15th century. That had a lot to do with why uh, you know exploration happened, because they started printing all these books and people wanted to know more about the world in general. So it spread ideas a lot faster. It also like helped spark the Reformation later. We'll get to that later next week. But then you can see on the far right, you've got the caravel, which I'll talk about. The caravel was a new type of ship that allowed navigators to sail like into the wind, like windward, and they could go all over the world with the caravel. Here I've got an image of the caravel right here. It's mostly a type of ship that was developed primarily by the Portuguese in the 15th century, although they do think that these kind of ships went back to probably the Middle Ages, maybe even further back to uh, Greco Roman times, probably influenced also by the Arabs in the Middle East. And some of these ships were some of the first to have like a major, like a rudder, which able to move the ship basically in different directions. They think the rudder was something that was invented in the Middle Ages, although early forms of rudders, I think, did go back to like China and Egypt. But one thing about the caravel, it had this triangular shaped sail on the back of it, which was either called a Latin or Latin rigged sail. And so that enabled the ships to sail windward. And so you can see on the left there, ships would have to tack into the wind, basically zigzagging, starboard tack to port tack as they sail upward into the wind. So it's very difficult to sail into the wind. You have to basically sail, I guess, diagonally. And caravels were pretty, they weren't that large. The average caravel, I think the tonnage was like 50, 60 tons, average length about 40 to 60 feet in length. I think I've got images showing like replicas of caravels, like the replicas of the Nina and the Pinta that were used by Columbus on his first voyage to the Americas. Average crew was about 20 to 30 men. And I think the average length of a caravel, it varied, maybe around 50 feet long. So they're not that large, these types of ships, but they use these ships to sail across the Atlantic, around Africa. I think even Magellan took some of these ships around the world as examples. They have larger versions that were called a carrack that they also built later. It's like a 100 ton ship, which was a little longer, maybe 60 feet long or longer, with a larger size crew to it. I think the Portuguese called it a neo also as well. Also, don't forget about Marco Polo. Marco Polo was also very influential as well with early exploration, kind of indirectly. He was a Venetian merchant that between the 1270s to about the 1290s went explored parts of Asia, ended up in China. You know about that. And he was actually a minister under the Emperor of China, Kublai Khan. And so Marco Polo was very vital. He came from his family came from Venice. And they think what happened was Marco Polo returned to, they think in the 1290s to Italy. And he ended up in prison. And he had this prisoner that was with him actually wrote down his stories into a book later that was known as The Travels of Marco Polo. I guess through the printing press, it became a popular book throughout Europe. And I think even explorers like Columbus read it and were influenced by Marco Polo because he talked about India and China and all that, and people wanted to try to sail there, etc. Marco Polo is going to be very important because what ends up happening between like the 13th and the 15th centuries, the Italians kind of become the middlemen in a lot of the Asian trade goods coming from the east to the west. towards Europe. They controlled it for a long time, and they even had an influence on starting the Renaissance because a lot of these merchant families, like in Florence and other cities, began to take a lot of the wealth and they spent it on art and things like that. Also, another influence on early exploration is Claudius Ptolemy, who you may have heard of. Ptolemy was this Greek scientist and geographer that lived. This would be like under the time of, I guess, second century CE would be the Roman period. But he was a scientist, geographer, astronomer, mathematician, and he wrote several books. Some books were, I think, he had one called Almagest, which was on astronomy. But the one that I guess became famous later for exploration was a book called Geography. And it was one of the first books that talked a lot about the Greco-Roman world, and he kind of mapped the world at the time. And so that is considered one of the first world maps ever created in the world. And you can see they had this vast ocean that was to the east, and explorers wanted to try to reach that at one point. So he was very influential. The only thing was, I think Columbus read the book too. He thought the world was smaller than what it really was at that point. Also, technologies had a major influence also on exploration as well. They had different inventions that were well known. Of course, you can see on the far left, they have the magnetic compass, which was actually originated from China. Came westward, I guess, because of Marco Polo and all that. So that was important for navigation. On the bottom there, you can see also what they call the mariner's astrolabe. They think that was developed by the Arabs in the Middle East, and it influenced also exploration, especially into Africa by the 15th century. Because I think Bartholomew Diaz by the 1400s began using it to explore Africa, and the astrolabe is important because it enabled the explorers and navigators to discover, what that latitude was like on the Earth, so they could navigate, north to south, and they could, use the stars. Also, the astrolabe could tell like what time it is using the sun. But the only thing about the astrolabe was it couldn't really give you like longitude. That's something that they wouldn't be able to figure out until the 18th century when they invent this so-called sextant, which they used the moon to later figure out what the longitude is. So you have that kind of technology being used. Also, early map making is something else that's also important as well. The Italians, they think, going back to maybe around the 13th, 14th century, started developing some of the earliest type of maps to map the world at the time, especially for navigation of ships. And they had what they call portalon charts, which portalon charts were basically these navigational charts that mapped out all the ports of basically, I guess, the European world at the time in the West. And so this, they think this map is a map of, they think, the 15th century world from the European perspective at that time in the 1400s. And so it's a map of mostly parts of Europe. You can see pretty much England, Spain, France, Italy, Greece, even the Black Sea. I think is kind of to the far right. Then on the bottom, you got Africa, also there. And you can see the Mediterranean Sea between Europe and Africa. Even as far east, you can see the Nile River I guess that's the Red Sea. That's in red right there. But that's basically kind of a map of the world at the time. But that's like primitive maps. They'll get more advanced maps, but you can see how the shape of Europe and Africa is already known at that time, by the 15th century. Now, one more thing I'll talk about as well that they think was a major cause of why exploration happened for a lot of the Western European powers. They had this thing happen in 1453 where the former Byzantine Empire collapsed. It was conquered by the Ottoman Empire or the Turks in May of 1453. Constantinople, which had been the capital, of the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire for years, it fell to the Turks. And so when that happened, that was a major turning point in history because after that, what happened was the Turks controlled a lot of the trade routes that went east to west, like across the Silk Road towards Europe. And so what happened was it forced a lot of the European powers to basically try to circumvent, that whole issue of Istanbul or Constantinople being cut off. And so that's why they sought, alternative sea routes to reach Asia. The Portuguese are going to try to go around Africa. And of course, Columbus in Spain has this idea to sail westward to get to Asia, where they discover America and all that. And so that's what actually causes that. So I don't know what would happen if that wouldn't have happened. That might have been, a changing point in history, but that's something that was a major reason why European exploration happened, that last one more than anything. Also, another thing I did want to talk about that was a major influence. Don't forget technologies like gunpowder, guns, cannon, and steel. Those kind of things played a major role in why the Europeans had such success. Exploration, conquest, colonization of different parts of the world, especially in the Americas. Disease is going to play a major role in part of why they're able to take over the Americas, because a lot of the Native Americans weren't used to a lot of the type of European diseases that they had, and it ends up kind of tragically wiping out a good bit of them. I think they say 90% of the Native American cultures were wiped out after the Europeans came and all that. Now I'm going to talk about next. I want to get into and talk about early exploration, which was heavily influenced by the Portuguese. The Portuguese were really the first modern explorers in the age of discovery. In fact, they actually create the first modern maritime empire that'll stretch, from Europe all the way into Asia at one point. They had other European explorers that came to the Americas. I don't know if you know it or not, but the Vikings, they think, discovered America close to about the year 1000 due to Leif the Lucky or Leif Erikson, you may have heard of before. But the Vikings later abandoned, you know, parts of America, and so they didn't come back. Europeans don't really come back until like 500 years later. Is what happens. But when I talk about Prince Henry the Navigator, who you see, who was a very famous figure as part of exploration. If you study about Prince Henry the Navigator, here you see on the right, he was very influential on really starting exploration. In fact, he's often referred to as the father of Portuguese exploration, the father of world exploration, because he influenced other powers to do kind of like the same thing overall. By the way, his real name is not Prince Henry. I think he's often referred to as, they often called him Dom Henrique of Portugal, or the Duke of Viseu is what he's actually referred to historically in Portugal. But people called him Prince Henry later. And then apparently in Germany, believe it or not, there were some historians that started to call him the Navigator and all that. And so the name stuck. And so that's a nickname he was called later, but he didn't really do a lot of navigation. In fact, he sent explorers, but he didn't really do too much exploration himself overall. But he was involved in a lot of explorations that led to discoveries. If you know about the Portuguese, they found like a bunch of islands in the Atlantic, like Madeira, you may have heard of, which is famous for its wine, Madeira wine. The Canaries and things like that were discovered also as well. Canaries and the Azores, I think they both discovered those. Azores too as well. And then also explored the West African coast as well. So those are all areas that they explored at one point. And I did want to mention about something that's very famous about the Portuguese. The Portuguese were heavily influenced by this legend you may have heard of called the Prester John legend that was circulating in Europe. That went back to like the Middle Ages, like 12th or 13th centuries. And the Europeans believed that there was this Christian king that lived in part of Africa, which they think was probably Ethiopia, which used to be called Abyssinia. And they thought his kingdom was going to fall to, I think, Muslims or something like that. And so they wanted to send help to him and trade with his kingdom. They make trade with it because a lot of the Europeans wanted to get into a lot of the sub-Saharan trade that went through that area. And so I think at one point Portuguese later would send envoys actually at one point into Ethiopia. And so that's kind of why they knew that Africa was the shape way it was. And they knew that there was an ocean over there at one point by the late 15th century. And so, yeah, you can see they think Prester John, he may have been, if you look at that image there, they think this kingdom, if there was some kingdom there, oh no, probably an African kingdom that was there actually. But it was probably in that area around Ethiopia, which they used to call Abyssinia, close to like there in Somalia. So that'd be like the Horn of Africa, they called it. But yeah, the Portuguese at one point sent explorers across there through North Africa to try to reach there at one point in the sometime they think in the 15th century. What happened was if you study about what happened with explorers, they have like different explorers that come later, kind of show you a map of Africa. You can see the Portuguese, after the death of Prince Henry the Navigator, they're going to start sailing down the coast of Africa, hugging like the west coast. They get into like the hump of Africa or West Africa at one point. The Portuguese do actually get into the Gulf of Guinea by I think, the 1470s. They discovered that area having a lot of gold. So they call it the Gold Coast, if you know about that. Also, parts were called the Ivory Coast because they found a lot of animals that have, ivory. Also, slave trade, they think, was started after African slave trade was started after that. They think by the Portuguese and others because of exploring Africa. Also, salt, I think, was another commodity that they also got in West Africa. And then by the 1480s, they began to sail down to close to where Angola is, which is on the southwestern coast of Africa, discovering actually the uh, Congo River that comes out there on the western side of Africa, right there. And so they start realizing that they can sail down to the bottom of Africa by the end of the 15th century. So that led later to a famous explorer that came next named Bartholomew Diaz, who lived in the late 15th century. Diaz was really the first European explorer that was successful in reaching the tip of Africa. He was involved in an expedition between 1487 to 1488 that they sought a sea route that could, reach basically to Asia, reach India at one point, or the Indies as they call it in Europe. And so that's why Diaz's expedition was very important. And his expedition was funded by this king named King John II at the time. And anyway, expedition was involved with like 3 ships. And at one point by 1488, they sailed down to where South Africa is today, the country of South Africa, a nation that's there now. And they sailed into a bay that's called now today Mossel Bay, where you can see February 3rd, 1480 is the date when he sails down there. And he did have one ship that was very famous that was on the voyage. I guess it's considered one of the first major ships that's well known in the early age of discovery, which is the Sao Cristobao, also known as St. Christopher. And if you know about St. Christopher, it's a famous saint that a lot of sailors kind of patronage because it's considered luck, for sailing. But anyway, what's funny about the whole thing, Da Gama wanted to call the tip of Africa, he wanted to call it the Cape of Storms. But when he got back to Portugal, the king of Portugal was like, I don't want to call it that because it might scare off sailors and all that. And so King John was the one that came up with the nickname Cape of Good Hope, or if you want the Portuguese, Cabo de Boa Esperanza. And so that became part of the name they sometimes call the tip of Africa, Cape of Good Hope. But it was also seen as optimism, great optimism that they could then sail around Africa and reach Asia. That's why it was kind of considered important, the name. I think Cape of Storms or Cabo das Tormentas, they dropped that, of course, that particular name. So anyway, I'm going to also talk about another explorer that's well known. Of course, you see here, which was, yeah, you got Vasco da Gama, who we just, of course, mentioned in that short little video. He's, of course, very, very famous, probably considered the most famous explorer, really, of the Portuguese. He, of course, sailed for the Portuguese in many expeditions. In fact, he had at 1.3 expeditions to reach India, which he does even up to like 1524. But his first expedition is the most famous one between 1497 to 1498. That was an expedition which involved four ships, 24,000-mile journey, by the way, to go back and forth to India. And you can see actually what happened was Da Gama went with Diaz on the expedition. He sailed with him to kind of tell him, I guess, where to go. And so he was able to eventually sail down to the tip of Africa again. And then from there, you can see what Da Gama did. He then hugged the eastern coast of Africa, sailing up past where Madagascar, as you can see. They landed at one point in Mozambique, Mombasa, on the east coast of Africa. And then by 1498, of course, you can see he reached Calicut, India. And I think he reaches it May 20th, 1498, when he arrives on the shores of India. And Da Gama's discovery of this sea route is very important. It's going to lead to an age of global imperialism, if you know about this, because it's going to enable the Portuguese to eventually establish like a colonial empire that's going to stretch, to Africa, Asia. At one point, they controlled, Brazil as well, the Portuguese. And so, yeah, it is one of the first major maritime empires that you'll have, throughout the world. And eventually, you'll see even the Portuguese controlling a lot of like the spice islands, like where the spices are all coming from, cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper, and things like that. They do kind of a control over a lot of the spice routes that reach to Africa. Oh, at one point, the Portuguese controlled the strait in Indonesia, you may have heard of, called the Strait of Malacca. Very important. And that strait's kind of be very vital between, like, I think between like China and India. And it's part of why the Portuguese controlled that area later until the Dutch and the British come in. But it's going to enable them to control a lot of vast amounts of territory for a while. And at one point, they even get into China and Japan, Portuguese. They even send like Jesuit missionaries and things like that to spread Christianity throughout that part of the world. So they're very vital, the Portuguese, and really starting the whole age of exploration and all that. They do have other explorers like Ferdinand Magellan, I'll get into later, that was also Portuguese, but he became more famous for sailing for the Spanish. I think they saw him as a trader when he switched over to that power instead. Now I'm going to move on next. I need to also talk about one more explorer I left out, which was Pedro Alvarez Cabral. He's another explorer that also came after also Da Gama. Da Gama later would actually become the viceroy of India at one point before he died in India. But there was one more explorer I did want to mention, which was Pedro Alvarez Cabral. He was involved in another expedition that followed Da Gama on the heels of his first expedition. And Cabral was the one that discovered um, Brazil, which they think he did by accident. I think there's a story that he basically got blown off course, and you kind of see in that map right there. But he ended up touching down where Brazil is, not that far where from Rio de Janeiro is, and he claimed it for Portugal. And so that's how the Portuguese end up with Brazil. Why, if you go to Brazil today, mostly Portuguese the main language that they speak. Then from there, he sailed towards Africa at one point. I think he landed in Africa somewhere, well, somewhere there. I know he did, and then he also went to India. So I think Cabral was one of the first explorers that actually was to actually go on three continents: Brazil, South America, Africa, and also part of Asia. And so that's going to enable, like I said, the Portuguese to expand this vast empire that they'll have, from Europe, America, to Africa, to eventually parts of Asia overall. Now, I'm going to get in next. I'm going to talk about also Christopher Columbus and the aftermath of his voyages, because Columbus really, I guess, in the end, is the main explorer that really influenced the most in the age of discovery or world exploration about the European powers. And Columbus, a little background about him. Columbus, of course, was an Italian explorer. I think everybody kind of knows that about his background. He was involved in four expeditions at one point to the Americas that lasted, I think, around, I want to say, 12 years, from 1492 to about 1504. I think the years for it. And if you know about, he was originally from Genoa, Genoese, and he was involved in a lot of early explorations with like the Portuguese and the Spanish, but he ended up really working more for the Spanish, especially the Kingdom of Castile, which is one of the main kingdoms that really got, I guess, Spain involved into the whole age of discovery, race to find all these new trade routes that were kind of going on. Columbus was unique. He had his own ideas, which was to sail westward. He wanted to go west to try to reach Asia. The Portuguese were trying to sail around Africa, exploring Africa at that point, and so he thought that it would be shorter to go westward instead. But he didn't know that the Americas, existed, of course. If you study about Columbus, I'll get more into his voyages, but let me talk first about uh, the different kingdoms. There, of course, you can see there. Those are the different kingdoms that would later make up the Spanish Empire, that they would call it later. That would be especially developed by the Habsburgs in Europe. But they often called the Catholic monarchs. These were the ones that really backed the voyages of Columbus in the late 15th century. Queen Isabella I, if you know about this, of Castile, married King Ferdinand II of Aragon. And so that actually helped to join what became the so-called Spains that would eventually, create the Spanish Empire. I think their grandson later, if you know him, Emperor Charles V or King Carlos of Spain, would really be one of the first kings that would be the head of the whole Spanish Empire. But Castile was the one that really backed the voyages. They were really the main kingdom that had the most wealth. And Spain was kind of coming out of a period where they had conquered the southern part of Spain, if you know that from Muslims, which was often called the Reconquista. And so the Spanish, like the Portuguese, wanted to get involved also in exploration. And they were probably influenced by also, Prince Henry the Navigator as well. But going back here, Columbus, his first voyage to the Americas was really the one that was the most famous one. He had four voyages, like total, like I said. You can see there in the first voyage, he was given three ships that became well known. I think everybody knows these ships overall, which is the Santa Maria, which I've got here. I think there's a picture on you see on there in the middle of the Santa Maria, which is a replica of it. But that was a carrack, which a carrack was a larger size ship that's similar to a caravel, which I think usually had three masts on it. Caravel was a little larger, I told you, than a caravel. I think I told you that the tonnage was close to 100 tons or something like that. Then you have the Nina and the Pinta as well. Those were caravels that were involved also on the first voyage. A little bit about all the ships. The Santa Maria was named after a church, the Church of St. Mary in Spain. and hence the name. And then the Nina meant the little child, and then Penta meant painted or painted ship, is what it kind of meant, basically. And supposedly they had these three brothers that helped Columbus on his first voyage. You may have heard of called the Pinzon brothers, which were I think their names were Martin, Vincent, and they also had Francisco. And they think they were the ones involved that maybe helped Columbus really find America, the Americas, and not him. I think some people think they found it, not him, but that's kind of debatable today. But I guess it's his voyage and all that. So you can see there, kind of expand that. You can see that the amount of sailors involved were like a little over 90 men. I think maybe 94 at the most may have been involved, men and boys that they're with it. You can see that the caravels were, yeah, close to about 70 feet in length at the most. And I told you that the Santa Maria is a larger type ship, of course, that they had. And I think I've got replicas showing those ships again right there, which the Nina and the Penta, which were later built, I think, of course, in modern times that you're looking at. Columbus, like I said, sought a westward route. And so his first expedition, which was, I think, often called the Expedition of the Indies, is what they called it because they were trying to reach India. And they set sail, they think, in August, early August. I think I want to say August the 3rd, I believe was the date when they set sail from Spain. And it would take them like 2.5 months, by the way, to eventually cross the Atlantic Ocean. I do have a map showing you Columbus's first voyage across. You can see they actually stopped in the Canary Islands because I think some of his ships had issues. And then from there, you can see he kind of sailed due west across the Atlantic Ocean. They do think at one point he may have actually sailed through the central part of the Atlantic, like south of Bermuda, which is often referred to as the Sargasso Sea, because there's a lot of seaweed in that area that's on the top of the sea. But I think they always joke about the fact that Columbus was one of the first to sail through the Bermuda Triangle. And there's actually stories they tell of seeing strange lights in the sky. I don't know if it's early UFOs or whatever, but some claim that he may have seen a UFO. I don't know. But you can see there, though, that Columbus ends up sailing toward the Bahamas. You can see right there. And he comes ashore, they think, on the date of October 12th, 1492. They land on an island that's now called today San Salvador Island, which I think in Spanish meant Holy Savior or Christ the Savior. And it's really the first meeting that occurs between the European powers, in the West, and Native American cultures, which I think was the Taino people that were living in those islands and in the Caribbean and all that. And they are, of course, intrigued with the Europeans. And of course, the thing that Columbus was fascinated about the early, the natives that he meets there is that he was looking for gold. I think he saw like gold earrings and things like that. And that was one of the first things that really turned him on. And so, thinking that he's close to India, if you know about this, Columbus calls Native Americans, he calls them Indians. And so the name basically stuck. You can see that the other name that they also called the island by the natives, Native Americans called it Guanahani. That's what they dubbed it. And then later, there was, I think in the 17th century, there was an English buccaneer, pirate named John Watling. He was English, and he used it as his base, I guess, to raid the Caribbean and all that. And so they called it Watling or Watling's Island as well. So it did have different names that they called San Salvador, but that was one of the first areas that Columbus would actually explore into the area. But Columbus is mostly known for exploring parts of the Caribbean Sea. That's where he goes into later at that point. And I don't know if he ever goes much into the Gulf of Mexico above that right there, but he is going to discover mostly on his first voyage. He goes and finds the island of the northern coast of Cuba is discovered at one point. And then also the island of Hispaniola is also discovered by Columbus. is where Haiti and the Dominican Republic is now today. And at one point, off the coast of Haiti, on its northern coast, one of his ships, which is the Santa Maria, it actually shipwrecked. And so he didn't have enough men to go back. He couldn't put all his men on two ships to go back to Spain at that point. And so what Columbus did was he actually took the Santa Maria and he built a fort out of it, creating like the first, I guess, European colony in that area on the island. And so he dubbed it La Navidad, which was founded around Christmas time in December of 1492. La Navidad means Christmas. And but I think he went back to Spain in 1492 on the Nina and the Pinta. And when he came back on the second voyage, all of his men had been wiped out in basically from the first voyage that were in that little colony. So it didn't. It actually failed at that point. They do have this deal later where Columbus had a brother named Bartholomew Columbus. You may have heard of him. He's the one that founded Santo Domingo, which in the 1490s becomes like one of the first European type cities that will be founded in the Americas. It's now, the capital of Dominican Republic today. That's his statue. You're looking at that right there, a brother of Columbus. And so he's kind of vital in really, leading to that. Here's kind of a picture of Santo Domingo, which is a pretty large sized city now, of course, that you're looking at. And so basically the Europeans are going to, like the Spanish, going to start trying to colonize like the Caribbean first. And then from there, they're going to expand into the Americas, North and South America also as well. So yeah, you got that going on at that point. I did want to talk about, let me go back up here just briefly, talk about Columbus and don't forget that Columbus was also, he had three other voyages. People forget about, Columbus's, third voyages, that second, third, fourth voyages that follow after the first one that happened. I think on the first voyage, nobody wanted to go, about this. And then on the second voyage, like 1,200 men went. And yeah, the other voyages, he explores the Caribbean Sea. That's one of the main things I told you he mostly did. And we also explored like the east coast of Central America from like around where Honduras is all the way down to Costa Rica and Panama were actually discovered by Columbus at that point. And they do think he got into the northern coast of South America, like the bays of Venezuela. He kind of went up in there and discovered the Orinoco River. That's also coming out of the eastern side of Venezuela, right there in South America. But if you think about all the different islands you've heard about in the Caribbean, or maybe you've gone to some of these that are there, but all these islands you see there, Guadalupe, Antigua, St. Martin, St. Croix, Virgin Islands, Great Antilles, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, Martinique, Grenada, Grand Cayman Islands. All those islands at one point were discovered by Columbus on pretty much all of his voyages to the New World. So these new discoveries were things that really were Columbus were starting to find were totally new to European powers. But Columbus, by the way, Columbus thought he was in Asia. That's the only thing about it. He really thought he was close to Asia and China. And so that's why he referred to, as the Native Americans as Indians because of that. Now, of course, there's one we'll kind of talk about next a little bit about the aftermath of Columbus and get into some of the things that really, will be influential towards the age of exploration afterwards. If you see here, one of the big things that happened after Columbus's first voyage, and also with the, Portuguese exploring parts of Africa and India, is that they're going to divide up the world. You see between them, there are different spheres of influence that you've got there. And so you've got predominantly, you can see the Spanish will end up getting most of the New World. You see there. And then, of course, the Portuguese will get parts of the Old World. And what happened was the Catholic Church under Pope Alexander VI was kind of concerned that war might break out between Spain and Portugal, fighting over these new lands that they were discovering I guess they were more worried about souls, right? They want to convert people to Catholicism, Christianity, and so he kind of came up with this idea to this treaty called later the Treaty of Tordesillas that came out in 1494, and they decided to divide a line around the world. It would go around from like the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, because I think they pretty much knew the world was round at that point. And so you can see there in the map that the line would run down through a meridian that ran through Greenland. You see, I think the original line was that gold line you see, which was, I think, came up with by him, the Pope at the time, in 1493. And then they kind of moved it to the west a little bit in 1494. And so that was the agreement right there. And so Spain got pretty much the Americas, you can see, and then the Portuguese would get like Africa and India and all that, and pretty much, I guess, the Pacific. And so the only thing was when they drew the line, they didn't understand that South America was under North America. Wait, it's kind of skewed. They thought it was directly under it. And so the line ran right down through South America, like the eastern side of it. And so Pedro Cabral was able to kind of sneak in there and grab it for the Portuguese. So the Portuguese end up with Brazil. They weren't supposed to get it. So anyway, that's kind of just talking about how they would divide the world up. But other countries like England, France, the Dutch, and others, and like in Europe, don't really see this as a viable treaty between those powers, and so they're going to try to come in and take their lands too, also from explorations later, which I'll talk about probably next week. Now, I did want to talk about something else that's also very famous too, if you know about in the Age of Discovery. They have this thing that also comes out, you may have heard of, called the Columbian Exchange, that occurs after Columbus' voyages that occurred. It's also sometimes called the Columbian Interchange, I think is another term that they use as well. And the Columbian Exchange is this was this thing that was invented, or it kind of was coined. If you blow this up here, it was coined by this historian and geographer named Alfred W. Crosby. He's American, and he wrote a book about it. It's called the Columbian Exchange, which I think came out in 1972. And what he said was that Columbus's voyages produced basically a lot of changes in the world, where basically ideas, plants, animals, diseases, and things like that. You had a worldwide exchange and trade between both these continents, and it had a major impact on the world overall, not just culturally but biologically as well. And so it's something that he became famous for developing. You can kind of see here in this map here, showing you the differences between the old world, Europe, and of course the new world. So you can see all these different things that were exchanged. A lot of plants and animals, were exchanged pretty much between the old and the new worlds. So in the new world, you had all kinds of things that came, to the Americas: corn, tomatoes, potatoes, peanuts, turkey, pumpkins, squash, sweet potatoes, pepper, tobacco, pineapples, cacao, which is chocolate, beans, and vanilla. So think about all the things we eat now. You go to McDonald's, right? You get French fries. Well, obviously, French fries, something that wouldn't be obviously available unless, I guess, Columbus discovered America. Same thing with pizza, like Domino's pizza or whatever. Tomato. They didn't start making pizzas with red sauce until after Columbus found, the Americas. No peanuts in your M&M. I guess no turkey for Thanksgiving. No pumpkins for Halloween. Whatever. So anyway, and then of course you can see from Europe, you can see all the things that came to the Americas. All kinds of livestock that we think of: cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, those kind of things. Those basically didn't exist in the Americas. Things like llamas or whatever, alpacas. I guess they had that, in the New World. They didn't have that. Honeybees, sugarcane, bananas, grapes, citrus type fruits you think of today. You think of like oranges in Florida, actually came to the Americas. Onions, olives, turnips, coffee, yeah, came from the old world. peaches, pears, different kinds of fruits, all kinds of grains you think of wheat, rice, barley, oats, whatever, all pretty much came from, of course, the old world overall. You can see, of course, there's another thing that's very famous too about, of course, the Columbian exchange. There's a lot of diseases that came from the old world to the new world: smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough. All those came to pretty much the new world. Of course, had devastating effects, leading to a lot of the Native Americans. Uh, that's part of why a lot of them died. They weren't able to sustain these types of diseases that the Europeans were kind of swimming in, and so it had drastic effects like that. So a lot of things that come from like Asia, like like COVID. I think a lot of your flu, swine flu, and all that have come also from Asia, things like that as well. Yeah, here's images of some of the different types of plants. So in this image, I think that's pretty much corn at the top left, tomato, potato, vanilla on the right. Oh, rubber. Didn't mention that one, but the rubber tree, believe it or not, originated in the New World. That's chocolate, cacao, really. They call it cacao. So they make chocolate out of on the left. I forget that. What's that on the left? I think that's, I forget what that is on the left. But that's another crop I know. But yeah, I know here's the New World ones I just talked about. I think mangoes on the top right. You see there banana, apples, citrus fruits, grains, coffee, that's kind of next to the onions, of course, as well. So those are all different things that kind of were exchanged pretty much back and forth overall. Another thing too in that map, I don't really have it there. They do think that it created later the triangular trade route. You know about that, which was a new trade route that went from Europe, Africa, and the Americas. So it's something that kind of helps to kind of continue the whole Columbian exchange back and forth between the old and the new worlds. And of course, it also was part of the whole African slave trade that occurred, where African slaves were brought to the Americas, which a lot of it was because of the diseases that the Europeans brought to the Americas. Native Americans couldn't handle it, and so they brought in African slaves that could, and that's why that occurred. Of course, the Middle Passage is the most famous, where Africans were brought from Africa to the Americas, and majority of Africans ended up in like mostly South America and later the Caribbean. Now, I'm going to get to also and talk about another figure that's well known. I did want to talk about who kind of influenced early exploration too, which is Amerigo Vespucci. I'm sure everybody's heard of him. He's kind of important overall. He's important because he's really one of the first explorers that kind of figures out that what Columbus found, like in the late 15th century, was not part of Asia. It was part of separate continents, the so-called New World. They would call it later. And so Amerigo Vespucci becomes well known. Of course, the Americas are named after him as well. He was Italian, like I said, just like Columbus was. And Vespucci, Amerigo Vespucci was known for this letter that he published in 1503, which was known as the Mundus Novus letter, which meant New World. And it popularized this idea that what Columbus had discovered was actually separate continents and not like part of Asia. Because remember, Columbus thought that they were near, China or the Indies or whatever, India, I guess. And so, but he realized that from his own explorations, which I'll show you a map here of Amerigo Vespucci. I'll get to that in a second, come back to that slide there. But you can see this map here that he went on several voyages. First with the Spanish in the late 15th century, 1499 to 1500. He had an expedition where he explored the northern coast of South America and then into the Caribbean. And then he later had two other voyages, 1501 to 1502 and 1503 to 1504, where he explored the southern part of South America as well. And so he starts to realize this doesn't look like India or China or whatever. And so From there, people start to realize that what he's actually discovered is totally separate. So, um, what's going to happen over time, because of the popularity of what Amerigo Vespucci has discovered, the term America is going to be start to be used for basically North and South America or the Americas. And they think that his name was derived from his Latin name, Americus. Americus Vespucius is how you say his name in Latin. And they think that his actual Latin name somehow evolved from a famous Hungarian saint named Saint Emeric, EMC. They think that's actually the origin of where the name America comes from a Hungarian, believe it or not. Yeah. But what it's going to lead, like I said, eventually later, they're going to start making maps, of the world. I told you that first maps was done by this Dutch cartographer named Abraham Ortelius, who actually made this map in 1570, which I think that's the original name. They call it Theatrum Orbis Terrarum. Some people call it the Typus Orbis Terrarum also as well. But you can see it's one of the first maps that actually maps out parts of the whole world. It's starting to look like, I guess the world looks like. So you can see, North America at the top, South America, down there, Africa. Africa's, they pretty much got the shape of Africa right pretty much at that point. Europe, you can see Asia, even parts of like you can east of the Indian Ocean, like in the Indonesia, all that, Philippines starting to take shape. And I guess they even kind of know that there's something down there like a landmass, like Antarctica and all that. So that's kind of the way the is looking at that point with the early age of sail between like in the 16th centuries. And it's going to later lead to exploration in America, explorers wanting to go into the Pacific Ocean and all that. I will talk about it later. I'm not today. I guess I'll wait till next week, of course, to get into it. But I'll talk about Ferdinand Magellan. He is known for one of the first major expeditions that's involved in circumnavigating the world, where they go around the world first to do that. His voyage is important because it really kind of opens people's eyes about what the world looks like, have the size of it and all that, and where the continents are, etc. So we'll talk more about that later next week. I don't think I've got any comments or questions. I know it looks like it today about this particular lecture, but if you do have any comments later about these lectures, do let me know. Like I think you can leave comments, questions on the actual lecture that's on YouTube. Also, I will be having some discussions later that I'll add in Canvas discussions, which are mostly about the study guide questions that I have. You'll have in Canvas. We'll kind of go through those, which are I'll let y'all share those with other students, which are worth bonus points, by the way. So I'll post that today overall. But like I said, don't forget about. I think y'all have got the those two things due this week. I know the pre-test contract policy page are both due by Friday. Try to get those done because if you don't do those, it's basically means that you're not going to be in the class. So even if you watch one of the lectures or whatever, but you need to try to complete one of those two, of course, for week one attendance and all that. So, but don't forget, keep sending me your book report titles, whatever book you want to do for your research paper for the fall. If you're interested in the Veterans Project, please let me know. Next week, I'll, of course, continue talking about exploration. I'll kind of wrap up that in a part 2 lecture. And then also, I'll kind of start on talking about also the period of the Reformation in Europe also as well. So that's it for today. Y'all hope you have a great rest of the week, first week of class at BRCC, and have also a great weekend coming up as well. So y'all take care, and I'll see y'all later.